Hello everyone, I couldn't be more excited. We've been working on this research for the past year, so let's jump right into it and let's talk rendering SEO. 3 years from now, JavaScript SEO won't exist. And as with most changes, this one comes with quite a lot of challenges that we're going to talk about today, but also it offers quite a lot of interesting opportunities to grow and be on the right side of the fence when this problem grows. And at Onely, we specialized in JavaScript SEO for the last few years, but we're slowly shifted, something that happened almost behind the scenes, even for me, into rendering SEO issues and indexing issues. And this presentation means a lot to me because this is something that we've been working on for quite a long time. So bear with me, there are a lot of data points here, but I'm gonna make it accessible, but also sit back, enjoy all of the links in the deck. Everything is gonna be included on the last slide. You will have the link to the full deck today. And as I mentioned, we focused quite a bit on solving indexing issues of our clients because we saw that those are closely related to JavaScript SEO. And it grew a little bit bigger. So let's start with a little bit of bad news. So first of all, 40% of content that relies on JavaScript is not indexed after 14 days. And it may sound geeky, but there's a very good chance that your content also relies on JavaScript. But it gets worse because 10% of URLs within an average domain are not indexed by Google, and we're talking unique indexable URLs. So this is something to look at, especially that those trends are changing over time and get worse. First of all, a brief history of JavaScript SEO. In 2015, Google was claiming that they are good with rendering. And in 2017, we've created an experiment after a lot of other experiments, including cloaking experiments with JavaScript and others. One experiment changed the course of JavaScript SEO, because after this slide from my presentation in Sydney in 2017, Google, within I think 3-4 days, started to talk openly about JavaScript SEO. And it's been amazing since then, because we have now Martin Splitt, who's amazing. We all like Martin, he's very helpful, but it's 2020, and Martin, please don't hate me for that, but we still don't know the most important part. We still don't know if our website is gonna render and rank properly. And I'm using the word JS-powered websites. I think I should stop, because right now, even if you're on Wix, WordPress, Magento, Shopify, your website is JavaScript powered. And this is the problem, because when we start to talk about those rendering and indexing problems, Google is not very eager to give us any kind of advice on how to see if your new website is gonna be rendered and indexed properly before doing that, basically by launching and deploying that website. So last year, we got a little bit sick of doing experiments because they are very limited, because those websites are somehow artificial. And we started gathering a lot of real data from real websites, and we started tracking indexing stats from thousands of real websites out there. And this research was not only very useful for us, it got some awards, but it also allowed us to see some of the trends in a different light. So for example, when Martin Splitt got on stage November last year saying that the median for rendering at Google is 5 seconds, and we see that 35% at a time, because now it's 45 or more, of JavaScript content is not indexed after 2 weeks. So it was far from those 5 seconds. So we knew that something is not okay. Also, we're seeing so many big brands with their products, with their listings, with their articles, not in Google's index. So all of those URLs on the screen, not indexed in Google. So you won't find those products, those creams from Walgreens and those articles from CNBC in Google. So these are some of the findings that we didn't expect. Some of the big brands really struggling with just getting indexed by Google. But also indexing HTML, so just your URLs, is not that easy. And those indexing trends fluctuate quite a bit during Google updates. Some of the Google updates actually target indexing I'm not sure if that's the only thing they're targeting, but they change how Google is indexing HTML and JavaScript, something I'm going to show you in a bit, because that was actually the last update from Google. But last thing, with some of the updates or without those updates, you can get kicked out of Google when there are more attractive URLs. But one of the challenges with diagnosing indexing drops right now is that the site command is not very reliable. It's going to return a lot of false negatives, and make sure to watch out for those. There are some ways around it, but this is a topic for a whole other presentation one day. And now you can see that the biggest challenge of 2020 is, and is gonna be, getting into Google's index. And indexing your content is an absolute foundation of your online presence. And this problem is gonna get even bigger with Google's limited resources, because they cannot render and index the whole World Wide Web, especially with the cost that now comes with a lot of modern websites. With that in mind, we can now see that the percentage of URLs indexed for a lot of big brands is quite shocking, frankly, because if you look at, for example, Yux, with 81% of their URLs, indexable URLs, not indexed by Google, this is significant. This is huge. And there are a lot of examples like this one. And our database is full of, actually, we have thousands of examples of websites struggling with indexing their content quite a bit. And just to visualize that even more, if you upload your product to your store, or you publish that article that you've been working on, and Google won't index that, all of the other activities you can do SEO wise, they don't matter at all. So we as SEOs, we like to get into those heated Twitter discussions that will never be solved, when I would love us to focus a little bit more on indexing issues, which are absolute foundation of anything else you're gonna do in the future of SEO. Because right now we can, fortunately, I'm so happy to see that for both SEOs and Googlers are addressing that issues, are starting that conversation about indexing. And also now we have precise data to validate such claims, and this is public. We made it accessible to all of you. We can see that Bartosz Schwartz wrote that there was some kind of indexing issues with the Google's core update 2 weeks ago. And we can see that, yeah, this was a case. There was some kind of change in the trend. We can see that Google started to index a little bit more JavaScript content, but they started to index a little bit less of the URLs of HTML content. So as I said, it's all very simple when you think about Google's limited resources. If they add a little bit more JavaScript indexing, they need to take it from HTML indexing. So we can see that Google is gonna try to somehow find a middle ground here. But we also learned from the last few years of solving those indexing issues that most of those problems are something we can act on as technical SEOs, and we can address those problems. And solving those technical SEOs indexing issues, they have the reward is really worth it, because the results we're seeing, traffic and revenue wise, are really wow. And with that said, let's get your website indexed today. And this is one of my favorite parts to explain here, because Google now has something called index selection. Let's imagine there is some kind of bouncer picking the URLs that will get into Google's index. But also, as we already established quite a few times, I think Google has limited resources. But when there are a little bit more resources available, Google is going to let in URLs from the end of the line, less attractive URLs, into the index. But it's a two-edged sword, because if there are like more attractive URLs in the line, you may get kicked out of the index to make room for those more attractive URLs. But the most exciting part for me, I guess, here is that this line starts as soon as your content gets rendered. You cannot stand in this line if you're not rendered. So you need to render your content to stand in that line to get indexed by Google. And rendering is something that we're gonna have a little bit of a look at now from the search engine's perspective. And before I move forward, I have a tiny bit of confession. First of all, most of the research here is based on hundreds of hours of research, so I only handpicked the most interesting and most valuable points. Secondly, due to the limited time today, we have only 20 minutes. There's gonna be a lot of simplifications, but that's also gonna help to make this presentation digestible even if you're not a technical SEO. So let's get it moving. So first of all, Google is looking at your website from a little bit different perspective. They look at your website from a batch optimized render and fetch architecture perspective. Let's call it BOR in short. And if we have a look at those side-by-side views, what Google is looking at is a little bit different than what we see in, for example, Chrome. And moving forward, if we go step by step, the first step for batch optimized rendering architecture is to remove all of the resources that they don't need to generate the preview or layout of our website. First being all the tracking scripts and ads, and then they remove all of the images as well. But we'll get into that in a second. This is more or less how your website looks like after removing all of those. And now that we have that preview, let's see what happened when we removed all of those resources. So first of all, we can see that just removing those extra resources saved us more than 50% of the load time, of rendering time, and so on scripting time, and so on. So this is something that saves quite a lot of resources on Google's end. The second step that Google is going to do now is that they're going to set the value of a virtual clock. And I'm going to explain what a virtual clock is in a second. And once the time on that virtual clock runs out, a website's layout is generated. So that's fairly simple. There are two key concepts to remember: virtual clock and layout. And let's start with virtual clock. So virtual clock is sort of a rendering budget from Google's side. And we get assigned a little bit of that budget, but we'll get into that in a second. So virtual clock measures the cost of our website's rendering. When rendering pauses to fetch a script or fetch a CSS file or fetch that image dimensions, that virtual clock is not advancing. So it only advances when we actually render. And so with that being said, we can already see that if you have a lot of CSS, if you have a lot of JavaScript within your website, you need more time on that virtual clock. You're not gonna get that though, but you need to understand that you need more of that time, because there is some kind of limit at Google of how much of that rendering budget, of that virtual clock time you're gonna get. We don't know what that limit is, and we can be fairly sure that we're never gonna get to know it, but we can see how resource hungry is your website. So if you use Chrome developer tools, you can slow down your CPU and see, for example, this is H&M. You can see slowing down your CPU, how it's gonna affect scripting and rendering. In case of H&M, it increased that time by 25 times. So we can see, okay, H&M may struggle with rendering and indexing, and in fact, they do. But there are some simpler ways to measure that virtual clock's load, let's call it that. And one of those is our tool, Too Long Didn't Render. The whole idea of this tool is to show you the cost of your website's rendering from 0 to 100. It's not perfect. It's not extremely precise, but it's going to give you a ballpark figure of if you should worry or not. Anything above 20, you could be worried about your rankings, and you should look into your script's load. A second way is to use Chrome developer tools to simulate that batch optimized rendering view preview I showed you before. And you can do that by following this link on the screen to see my YouTube video with how to do that at your home. And now we're entering one more exciting part. So when virtual clock's time runs out, the layout is generated regardless of if it's halfway through rendering or not. So this leads to a lot of potential challenges, but also this is where JavaScript SEO ends and rendering SEO begins, because rendering has a lot of focus on layout, on how layout plays out with this whole idea. And if we look at that we already knew that content location matters for quite a while. We knew that text appearing above the fold is more important than the one below the fold. It turns out that it also affects how Google is gonna crawl that content. So depending on the prominence of the section, Google is gonna look at different sections of the websites, and it's gonna look at those links within those sections with a different priority, which leads to a lot of then rendering issues, because we're gonna see in a second that Google also is using similar heuristics. We think this is something we see in our toolset to pick which parts of your website to render and index. But let's get into that in just a second. And just one thing, according to Google's documentation, ads are a terrible place to be. Don't have any links in ads or anything like that. So with that in mind, we can see now that JavaScript SEO was very focused on if Google can see our content. Rendering SEO is way beyond that, and it's a much broader topic, because apart from just seeing the content, we're now interested in the layout, in where the links are placed, and a lot of factors that have to do with how a website is rendered and how it looks like after that. And one of those things is images. I already mentioned that Google is not looking at real images, they're using mock images. And how that plays out, let's have a look at the real life example, again from H&M. So first of all, cache all of your images, especially the ones that show up on every single page within your domain. Secondly, closely monitor all of the 404s, because if you didn't include image dimensions in the code, or your image is not in a separate div with those dimensions, a single image may cause your layout to shift completely. And in case of H&M, just removing the logo shifts the layout quite a bit. So Google can struggle with matching some of the signals from the real website with the generated layout. And also authorize CDNs and subdomains, because that's where 80% of Google's bandwidth is happening, and that's also where quite a lot of our technical SEO work should be happening. But that's a topic for a whole other presentation. And the value of links also depends on their location and attributes, something we also knew for quite a bit, but this is getting more and more interesting when we look into next patterns from Google. So first of all, positions of the link within the page matters, and that affects how Google will crawl that link and what kind of rating, let's call it that Google will assign to that link. But also some sections within your layout, within your page, will get more prominence, more link juice than others. And for example, this case from CNN.com is an exact quote from one of Google patents. We can see that links positioned under more top stories, so we can be now sure that these are basically internal links, have more probability of being selected. So we can see Google is using heuristics of some sort to pick more important internal links. But what we found out through research is actually extremely exciting for me, because they use very similar heuristics to pick which parts of your website should be rendered and which of those can be skipped. Because over the last almost a year, we were picking parts of popular websites to see which part of a given layout is indexed and which is not, to diagnose partial indexing. And what we see after looking into months of those findings is that Google seems to ignore some parts of the websites more eagerly than others. So for example, similar products seem to be part of the layout that Google is very keen on ignoring when indexing your content. So looking at this example, Google will most likely index your main content, but there is a very good chance that if your website is very heavy on the scripting and rendering side, they will skip part of your page that is not as crucial as the main content after Google tries to understand that layout. And speaking of partial indexing, you may think that those are not that significant of a problem. And Google mentioned quite a few times that they will interrupt scripts when they're heavy, but we didn't know what that means until today actually. So this is the first time we were publishing this data. So we assumed before that they will interrupt the rendering regardless of where they are within the script when the virtual clock's time is out. But looking at our data set, something that we are now considering is that maybe they will just skip some less important parts of the layout. And this leads to all sorts of problems, because when they index your main content first, we can assume that this is a smart decision from Google. Okay, let's ignore the main content. This means they have to skip something. And skipping one part of your website, of your layout, may and will lead to very serious indexing and crawling issues. And that's gonna get us back to this problem where just that 40% of JavaScript content that not so many of us think, okay, this is significant, leads to URLs not being in Google index from like 10% to 81%. And you can see that this is going way beyond JavaScript now and beyond JavaScript SEO, because rendering happens with and without JavaScript. And JavaScript is not the primary reason for rendering and never was. And with that in mind, I can see, should we even call it JavaScript SEO now? Because first of all, rendering seems to be a bigger and broader concept, but it's also going to address all of the other problems that JavaScript SEO doesn't address. So we're going to have an in-depth webinar on this topic. And if you can sign up to that webinar by going to renderingseo.com, and renderingseo.com is going to be led by our one and only Tomek. We're lucky to have Tomek as our head of research and development. Not only he's one of the smartest SEOs I know, he's so excited about the topic of rendering and JavaScript SEO and indexing. So he's going to share a lot of his knowledge on renderingseo.com, because this is going to be Tomek's baby for the foreseeable future. And going through some of the key takeaways, because we're running out of time. First of all, this is going to be a topic that's going to grow bigger and bigger, because again, Google is now not able to render and index the whole World Wide Web. So the line to Google is going to get longer. And if you're not indexed, all of the other things you're doing, they don't matter, because without rendering, your content doesn't exist online. And indexing is something you can see, you can measure, and it directly drives revenue. This is not something we can see very often in marketing. If you see the problem with your indexing, you can quickly see that there is a massive potential of traffic and revenue behind it. And for the first time in history, we now have a good understanding of how rendering and indexing works at Google. So let's all make good use of it, especially in these crazy times. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking today. And thanks so much for coming to my session. Thanks so much for coming to eSummit, and enjoy the rest of this wonderful conference. And don't hesitate to DM me, to email me. And the link to the deck is here at one.ly/eSummit. Thank you so much.